The West and the rest of us. White predators, black slavers, and the African elite. I'll be reading from The West and the Rest of Us, Chinweizu. To the memory of all the victims of the West's assault upon the rest of us, and of the following especially, the Amerindians and the Aborigines of Australasia, who were exterminated and expropriated, the millions of Africans who were enslaved in the Americas, the countless Africans who died resisting European invasion and occupation of their homeland, the soldiers from the Third World who were conscripted to fight and die defending the very Western empires that victimized them, to all Third World liberation fighters and martyrs who have struggled or died for a better future for their peoples. To the people of the West, to the extent that they refuse to tolerate Western control over the rest of us, and to all of us, that we may achieve a just, non-imperialist, and enduring peace, with prosperity for all humankind. Acknowledgements. In the course of putting this volume together, I have naturally acquired debts of gratitude to various persons and institutions, to the American Studies program of the State University of New York at Buffalo. I owe an incalculable lot. I learned much. My perspectives broadened and my perceptions sharpened through my association with it. In addition, a fellowship with the program helped to support my work on this book. I thank the program and wish its members all the best. The following persons have also been of special help to me. They are Chinweizu, Jeanne Bell, Larry Chisholm, Stanley Diamond, Onwuchekwa, Jimmy, Charlie, and Angie Keel, Liz Kennedy, Ucheng Kim, and Stanley Macaba. They read parts of the manuscript at various points in its evolution and pointed out passages that required clarification or additional treatment. I thank them all, and I hope that I have been able to satisfactorily use their suggestions. I also want to thank, especially in this regard, my editor at Random House, Toni Morrison. To many scholars, I owe debts far in excess of what is reflected in my footnotes. I must record my debt to a whole generation of Africanists, though the published works of all but a few of them differ in interpretation and thrust of concern from mine. They have nevertheless provided much of the substantiating data for my positions. For similar debts, I must also thank many students and historians of America. Both of the orthodox and so-called revisionist schools, it is perhaps customary to limit one's scholarly acknowledgments to those whose contributions to a written work have been made through their writings. This may well be a case of the medium limiting one's obligations to those that are verifiable within it. The medium may always condition the presentation of the message, but in my judgment, it is rarely ever the message. Therefore, where, as in this case, the positions presented were arrived at least as much by talking with sundry persons as by reading, and where written materials have mainly been relied upon to provide public and verifiable evidence for my contentions, I find it very much in order to acknowledge, however inadequately, intellectual debts I have acquired through media other than print. I must therefore also thank those others, too numerous to name here, with whose lives mine has crossed, and from whom I have learned much. Among them have been diplomats, thugs, cabinet ministers, agitators, scholars, rioters, politicians, political prisoners, journalists, seditionists, artists, critics, soldiers, mercenaries, warmongers, pacifists, and anti-war crusaders, bureaucrats, farmers, businessmen, laborers, bankers, janitors, lobbyists, campaign workers, men of the cloth, women of pleasure, persons of practically all imaginable political persuasions, teachers, colleagues, friends, and just plain folks from many parts of the world. Without access to their varied experiences, reminiscences, and insights, I would not have acquired the perspectives on affairs that have made this work possible. To them all I say thank you. Chinweizu, Cambridge, Massachusetts, March 1974. Forward. I should perhaps begin by noting that this is not a work of protest. It is rather a critical investigation into the purposes and styles of Western imperialist expansion during the past 500 years. It is also an investigation within the context of that expansion into the man-made causes of Africa's backwardness. It is unnecessary to add any more to our mountain of lamentations. It is too late for us, the imperialized, to weep upon the shoulders of those who have brought about our oppression, for sympathy toward our plight. We need rather to understand our past defeats if we want to avoid the deadly shocks our future seems to be holding in ambush for us. And to do so, it is imperative that we revise our understanding of the history of which we are products. This book should, therefore, be seen as a long letter to the Third World, and especially to those who fancy themselves to be the African elite, pleading for a moment to listen closely and analyze the tunes being played to us by the Pied Pipers of progress from the West, before we decide whether and how we should march out after them. This work is a preliminary re-examination of the main structures that have determined international relations for the past 500 years. It was instigated by several events of the late 1960s. Chief among these were the spreading delusion among Africans with their much celebrated independence, the Afro-American rebellion against their suffering under the systemized racism, the American intervention in Vietnam that devastated that land, and the ferment among America's youth against racism and against what they were finally beginning to see as their country's imperialism. Special mention must be made of the Nigeria-Biafra War, in which, no matter the local causes, Africans killed millions of Africans, and African leaders suffered them to be killed for the primary and ultimate benefit of British investments in Nigeria. Had we understood better the international context in which our problems would be so manipulated, we might have found other solutions to our troubles. My efforts to understand that conflict and its implications convinced me that we of the Third World, and Africans especially, must endeavor to see clearly the larger system of things in which we are enmeshed, or be irretrievably lost in the catacombs of irrelevant details, and that we must understand the awful predicament that binds us together, or we shall be repeatedly manipulated to fight one another and so hasten the march of disaster upon ourselves. Such were my preoccupations when, in November 1971, on a contract from my publisher, I began to work on what has turned out to be this book. Since we all know that we were conquered and imperialized, and since how and why are not always obvious, I have found it invaluable to focus upon the arsenal of techniques accumulated to serve Western imperialism, and upon the structures and processes whereby the West constrains events, determines our views and actions, shapes our realities. If this approach should contribute to clarifying for the ordinary reader, not the expert, how that world stage was put together and is managed, upon with which African and other third world nations have to perform to regain their liberty. If it should help us decrease even by one jot or tittle our susceptibility to being lured by carrots, intimidated by the lash of sticks, or stampeded by hysteria into collaborating in the defeat of our enlightened national interests, then this work would have done more than I could seriously hope for. America's pets, cats and dogs, now consume $2 billion worth of resources annually, and eat much better than most of humanity, dining elegantly on shrimp cocktails and liver pate at such places as the Animal Gourmet restaurant in New York City. Thus, in its most dramatic and obscene form, the question is whether the labor and resources of the third world nations should continue to contribute more to the opulence of America's dogs and cats than to elementary good health of third world humans. We should always have present in our minds the fact that the world is at a crossroads. It is no longer divided by ideology, nor even all that much by race or political geography, but by economics. And this is the real essence of the question of relations among the peoples of the world today. It is not enough just to condemn colonialism, imperialism, and racism, but it is important to measure our strengths and weaknesses, and to unify to fight the battle of development. That is why I utter a cry of alarm, so that we may all forget our small rivalries and our small sordid interests in order to constitute among ourselves in unity a great force, not a force against the East and the West, but a force which would enable us to be able to sit down and talk as equal partners with both sides. President Mobutu Sese Seko of the Republic of Zaire, October 1973. The global aggression by the West. Their gain shall be the knowledge of our faith, and ours such riches as their country hath. Sir Francis Drake. Their gain shall be the knowledge of our faith, and ours such riches as their country hath. When they first came, they had the Bible. We had the land. We now have the Bible, and they have our land. An African saying. 1. The assault by the West upon the rest of us. For nearly 6 centuries now, Western Europe and its diaspora have been disturbing the peace of the world, enlightened through their Renaissance by the learning of the ancient Mediterranean, armed with the gun, the making of whose powder they have learned from Chinese firecrackers, equipping their ships with lantern sails, astrolabes, and nautical compasses, all invented by the Chinese and transmitted to them by Arabs, fortified an aggressive spirit by an arrogant messianic Christianity of both the popish and Protestant varieties. and motivated by the lure of enriching plunder. White hordes have sailed forth from their Western European homelands to explore, assault, loot, occupy, rule, and exploit the rest of the world. And even now, the fury of their expansionist assault upon the rest of us has not abated. Portuguese and Spanish seafarers were the first wave of the white peril to descend upon the rest of us, beginning with their sally in 1415 across the Strait of Gibraltar to capture Ceuta, a thriving terminal of the trans-Sahara trade in West African gold. The Portuguese went south and east to spread their Christian faith, to seek contact with Prester John, believed by European legend to be king of Christian Ethiopia, to hunt for gold and to search for spices. By the late 15th century, their rovings had brought them to the coast of West Africa. They bought ivory, spices, and gold, and seized slaves. By the early 16th century, their rovings had brought them to the Swahili coast of East Africa, and to the shores of Arabia, Persia, and India. There they attacked and seized mastery over the Indian Ocean trade of the native Kiswahili, Turks, Persians, Arabs, and Indians. They pushed on beyond the Malayan Peninsula to the Indonesian and Philippine archipelagos of Southeast Asia to secure spices. From there, they went on to the South China Sea and to Japan. Their attempts to impose themselves on China and Japan were quickly defeated by the Chinese Coast Guard fleets and curbed by the Tokugawa shoguns of Japan. Their encroachments upon the rest of the world yielded them a 16th century empire run from Lisbon and made profitable by plantations in Brazil and Angola, by slaving in Africa, and by the spice trade in South Asia. Amboina, Axum, Bahia, Calicut, Cochin, Elmina, Fort Jesus, Gao, Hormuz, Jaffina, Luanda, Macau, Malacca, Mambosa, Pernambuco, Rio de Janeiro, Sao Tome, Sofala, and Ternate became the major forts, settlements, and trading posts of this empire. Spurred on by the successions of their Portuguese neighbors, the Spaniards attempted to participate in the lucrative trade, but were blocked by a papal award of 1455, which had granted to Portugal a monopoly over the trade of the lands she came upon to the east. In theory, the Spaniards were restrained by the papal bull, In practice, they were blocked by the armed vigilance of the Portuguese. The Spanish effort, 1475 to 1480, to take much of the West African trade from the Portuguese failed. The Spaniards then headed west, hoping to reach the Spice Islands of the East by circumnavigating the world. If they reached the Spice Islands by going west, they would circumvent the language of the Papal Award. In 1492, Columbus claimed that he had reached the Spice Islands. Spanish hopes rose. When these islands turned out not to be the spice-laden Indies, the Spaniards pushed on. In 1521, Magellan circumnavigated the world. He entered the Spice Islands from the western door and claimed the Philippine Islands for the crown of Spain. But at about the same time, the Spaniards struck gold and silver in the American mainland of what Columbus had earlier mistaken for the Indies. Their luck had turned in a land they had thought barren and profitless. They subsequently abandoned their efforts to contest Portuguese mastery over the Euro-Asian trade. Instead, their conquistadors marched on the American mainland. Cortez overwhelmed the Mexican Aztecs. Pizarro massacred the Peruvian Incas into submission. The Spanish conquistadors uprooted the societies they conquered, stole their silver and gold and gems, and carried all off to Europe. Successful brigandage. By luck and ruthless aggression, the Spaniards had secured for themselves an empire richer than that of the Portuguese. Spanish priests set about converting the vanquished Amerindians to Catholic Christianity, while Spanish settlers put them to work mining silver and gold, planting spices, and raising hides. This Amerindian labor was soon deemed unsuitable and was supplemented by the labor of Africans imported to share the toil. The empire's commerce was regulated from Seville. Madrid was its capital, and Buenos Aires, Callao, Cusco, Florida, Havana, Lima, Manila, Port Royal, Puerto de Navidad, Quito, San Juan, and Veracruz were some of its cities, settlements, and ports. But the monopoly these pioneers held over European procurement of the silver, gold, spices, and labor of the rest of the world, though sanctified by the Papal Bull of 1493 and legalized by the Luso-Hispanic Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494, did not long go unchallenged by the other nations of Western Europe. The sight of so much bullion quickly bullion quickly stimulated the competing greeds of the English, French, and Dutch. They were to make up the second wave of the white peril that pounced upon the rest of the world. Late in the 16th century, the English and the Dutch began to use their sea power to nibble at the lucrative overseas empires of Portugal and Spain. Such English pirates as Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh, organized and encouraged by Elizabeth I, their virgin and pirate queen, made the Atlantic unsafe for the Spanish treasure fleet. They raided Spanish America, pounced upon Spanish galleons on the high seas, and seized what bullion they could. The Spanish Armada was sent to invade England and blunt the English challenge, but it was scattered by wind and battle. Sir John Hawkins, a pirate trader who, like the Buccaneers, had Elizabeth's support, penetrated the Portuguese monopoly of the lucrative trade and supplied African slaves to Brazilian and Spanish American plantations, but attacks from her rivals notwithstanding, at the end of the 16th century, a world-plundering Spain was the greatest European power. Its empire, augmented in 1580 with that of Portugal through a merger of the Portuguese and Spanish crowns, stretched from Macau in China to Potosi in Peru, girdling the globe. But from its vastness, it would speedily contract under challenge from its dogged rivals. At the start of the 17th century, the Dutch used their quarrels with Spain to initiate an attack on the Portuguese Empire. They used their sea power to seize from Portuguese control ports and coastal settlements around the world. Nor did they abandon this campaign of dispossession after Portugal was again separated from Spain in 1640. By the time this contest ended in the 1660s, the Dutch had wrested from their predecessors control of the commerce in Asia, in Asian spice, and of the carrying trade of the East Indies, had punctured the Portuguese monopoly of the West African trade in gold, ivories, and slaves, and had temporarily won, but finally lost, back to the Portuguese, the sugar plantations, and the trade of Brazil and Angola. The Portuguese Empire was thus much diminished by competition from another expansionist nation of Western Europe. While the Dutch concentrated on fighting the Portuguese for predatory privileges over the African and Asian peoples in the Portuguese Empire, the British and the French spent the 17th century competing for possession of the vast North American mainland. Though belonging to Spain by papal decree, most of North America had not been physically taken over by Spanish settlers, with the British and the French in the lead. Settlers from other European nations moved in. The Dutch settled in the Hudson Valley, the French in the St. Lawrence and lower Mississippi valleys, and the British everywhere else on the east coast of North America. While carrying on their national rivalries, these European settlers pushed westward to displace the Native American Indians population and seize their land. Each side praised the American Indians and enlisted to scout and fight for it, and damned the American Indians who supported its rivals. But of course, whichever European side won in a given conflict, the American Indians would lose some more of their homeland to the invaders from Europe. As white settlements grew, blacks from Africa were sent for to till the plantations. That demand, added to the South American demand, intensified the traffic in African slaves and spread disaster and depopulation over Africa. Thus did Amerindians and black Africans undergo social devastation and subjugation for the benefit of the Western European diaspora in the Americas, because they were preoccupied in the 17th century with non-Spanish North America and with the Portuguese Empire. It was not until early in the 18th century, with the War of the Spanish Succession, that the English, French, and Dutch finally turned their combined fury upon the Spanish Empire. The French contrived to inherit all of it by way of royal succession. The others went to war to stop them. When, in 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht ended that war, the union of the Spanish and French empires was renounced. The defeated members of the Franco-Hispanic alliance were forced to yield to the British various parts of French and Spanish America. The British, furthermore, granted themselves a 30-year monopoly over the importation of African slaves to all the Americas, thereby further diminishing what the Dutch had left of the Portuguese trading empire. Thereafter, Iberian expansion ceased. Having passed their predatory prime, Spain and Portugal would hang on as best they could to their diminished empires, while new stars carried on the enterprise of Western expansion. Another causality of the War of Spanish Succession was French expansion into North America. Driven out of North America by the very victorious British, the French retired to the Indian subcontinent and concentrated their empire-building efforts there. But the British soon wanted India too. In the struggle that ensued there between them, the British were again victorious. By the 1760s, the British had driven the French out of India, only to find themselves a decade later kicked in turn out of eastern seaboard of North America by the revolt of the colonies they had planted there. Thereafter, British expansionist activity turned east to Australia and New Zealand. It also intensified on the Indian subcontinent, where, with their French rivals out of the scene, British encroachments on the sovereignty of the native states of India spread. By the middle of the 19th century, all of that subcontinent had come under British rule. By the end of the 18th century, when this second wave of the white peril had spent itself, new branches of the Western European diaspora had been planted in the Americas, Australia, New Zealand, India, Indonesia, and southern tip of Africa. and the southern tip of Africa all through the 19th century. While the Industrial Revolution was magnifying European power and while preparations were intensifying in Europe for the grand Western assault on Africa and Asia, settlement and exploitation of areas won by the first and second hordes of predatory Westerners did not stop. The Spanish and Portuguese diaspora in South America, like the British diaspora in North America, revolted and claimed political independence from Portugal and from Spain. They reorganized the lands they had settled into Spanish and Portuguese-speaking republics. The Dutch diaspora in southern Africa, known as the Boers, pushed north, dispossessing the Aboriginal Bushmen, Hottentots, and Bantus of what would later become the Anglo-Boer Republic. I think they call it something. French efforts to plant settlements of their people overseas petered out. French efforts to plant settlements of their people overseas petered out, never having recovered from their blows. The British dealt them in North America and in India during the 18th century, so everywhere else in the 19th century. In a world-spanning effort, the British diaspora won Australia from its Aborigines, New Zealand from the Maoris, North America from the Amerindians, thereby turning two vast continents into new homelands for the English-speaking people. While the European diaspora were occupied with winning these new lands, the rise in the late 18th century of industrial nationalism under the leadership of the European bourgeoisie gave fresh impetus to and transformed the character of Western European expansionism. The pre-industrial expansion of the preceding centuries had been undertaken to procure spices and other agricultural products for European consumption, to seize lands and settle Western Europe's excess population upon them, and to fetch precious stones and metals to Europe. While some of these precious stones and metals went into ornamentation, the bulk of them went into the organization of Europe's trade. The gold and silver bullion that the Spaniards looted from America and shipped to Europe would serve as the physical repository of exchange value in the rapidly developing capitalism of Western Europe. 3 centuries of settler expansion and primary capital accumulation had prepared the ground for Europe's Industrial Revolution. It had also advanced a position of the emerging European bourgeoisie within the basically still feudal societies of Europe. It had advanced them to a point where they found it necessary and were able to seize political power in their nations, and then use the power of the state to organize their industrial nationalist expansion. The most spectacular event of this kind was the French Revolution. These revolutions, industrial and political, which gave birth to Europe's industrial nationalisms, changed the primary demands that Europe would henceforth make upon the rest of the world. The traditional demand for land on which to settle the excess European population began to taper off. What had been considered excess population was now needed to work the mines and rising factories of Western Europe. Colonization, in the strict and classical sense of the term, namely the sending out of bands of citizens to plant new communities, was over. The purposes of Europe's overseas trade also changed. It would no longer be primarily for securing some agricultural products from non-Westerners and for procuring labor to produce them, others on land settled by the European diaspora. The organizers of Europe's rising industrial trade became as much interested in securing overseas markets for their products as in procuring of agricultural and mineral resources for their factories. Consequently, their interest in carting native laborers to their American settlements began to decline. Under the new scheme of things, the natives of Africa and Asia would render better service if they were left in their homelands and reorganized there to supply the factories of Europe with raw materials, and they were stimulated to consume more and more of the products of these factories. Given these changes and demands, the character of Western expansionism also changed. Henceforth, under the stimulus of their industrial revolution, they would hurry out to seize whatever lands they had not already seized, to subjugate whatever peoples they had not already subjugated, and to colonize them all in detail. In a ruthless campaign to obtain the markets and resources that would yield the fantastic riches their industrial revolution was beginning to make possible. The British pioneered the Industrial Revolution. Their conquest of India was the first fruit of industrial nationalist expansionism. India was occupied and brought under firm British authority during the years of 1760 to 1858, coinciding with the period 1760 to 1840, when the Industrial Revolution was being pioneered in England. India was therefore a prototype of the third industrial wave of Western European expansion overseas. Unlike the Americas, British India was not an empire for permanently settling the Western European diaspora. Unlike the Portuguese Asian Empire, British India was not a mere string of coastal settlements and trading stations. The British established themselves over India, not merely to control its trade or to displace the natives and settle on their land, but to rule them and to reorganize and exploit their toil for the benefit of an industrial Britain. Following the British led in this novel mode of expansion, the French. Following the British led in this novel mode of expansion, the French arrived in Annam, Indochina, in 1799, and by 1867 had annexed it. This period again largely coincides with the period 1800 to 1848, during which the French Industrial Revolution was accomplished, and just as the British and India, the Industrial Revolution in France helped determine the character of the French expansion into Indochina. In the early 19th century, while completing their conquest of India, the British began and led the assault by the industrial nationalisms of Europe upon Africa and upon those parts of Asia to the east and west of India, which they called from their Eurocentric geography of the world the Middle East and Far East. The Middle East and the Far East. The era of gunboat diplomacy of the early 19th century marked the first skirmishes in the Western European invasion of these lands. The dispatch to West Africa in 1810 of a British squadron with orders to end the slave trade and protect British traders and non-human commodities, the Opium War, which Britain waged on China from 1839 to 1842 in order to force her to buy and consume opium that the British grew in India, and U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry's expedition to Japan in 1853 to force her to open herself to Western trade. All were the knocks on the door before entry would be forced. For the United States, scion of Britain and heir to her expansionist tradition, Perry's call on Japan was like a rite of passage. She was winning her spurs and showing how much a chip of the world British imperialist bloc she was. But in spite of America's dabblings in East Asia, the principal industrial nationalisms would remain European up until the end of the 19th century, and their next victim would be Africa. In post-Napoleonic Europe, the Belgians, Italians, and Germans, following the lead of the British and the French, each found national unity and made strides in industrialization. As each became a model industrial nation, it made its own bid of empire. Their initial reconnaissance showed them that of the areas available for their industrial nationalist expansion, Africa, Europe's southern neighbor, was the easiest prey and potentially the most lucrative. Therefore, by the third quarter of the 19th century, the enlarged pack of Europe's imperial vampires began to converge on Africa. In 1885, they drew up a Berlin Treaty detailing rules to guide them in their scramble for Africa. At the time of the treaty, the various European toeholds on the continent were as follows. Spain occupied the Canary Islands and the island of Fernando Po. Portugal held the islands of Sao Tome and Principe, occupied parts of the coast of Mozambique, and had settlements at Luanda and Benguela on the coast of Angola. Italy had Assad on the Red Sea coast of Ethiopia. Germany had trading posts and settlements on the coast of southwest Africa, Cameroon, Togo, and Tanganyika. France was installed in Algeria and Tunisia, and also had trading and military posts in St. Louis and Gorée on the Senegal coast and at Grand Bassam, Assini, Porto Novo, and Libreville, all on the west coast of Africa. Britain had trading posts in Niger Delta, settlements on the Gambia River in Sierra Leone, on the coast of the Gold Coast and the Cape Colony in South Africa. They exercised protectorate powers over Egypt and the Upper Nile Valley. How Britain obtained protectorate powers over Egypt and the Upper Nile is instructive, for it underlines the industrial basis of this phase of Western expansionism. When the scramble for Africa began, Western expansionism had become infectious. Egypt, though nominally a part of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, got it into her head to carve out an African empire for herself, too. She regarded the Upper Nile as her right and proper frontier, a black African backyard to be possessed and imperialized from Cairo, in the manner of the European overseas empires. However, lacking the means to carry out her ambitions, Egypt recruited such Europeans as Werner Munziger, Samuel Baker, and Charles Gordon to lead her imperial expeditions into Black Africa. Baker and Gordon annexed southern Sudan for Egypt, making it the equatorial province of Egyptian Sudan. Darfur was conquered in 1874. Munziger organized Egyptian expeditions against Ethiopia in 1875 and 1876, but both invasions were defeated. This Egyptian expansionist frenzy ended in fiasco for Egypt and led to British occupation of Egypt in 1882. Without first becoming an industrial power, Egypt could not sustain her imperial enterprise. She did not have the economic base to buttress her grandiose ambitions. She therefore not only relied on European soldiers of fortune to command the troops she sent against the Sudan, but she also relied on European financiers to bankroll her ventures. After Egypt went bankrupt from this sad imperial effort, her finances were taken over in 1876 by a consortium of Western European powers. Feeling humiliated by that, Egyptians turned nationalistic and in 1882 rose against Europe's imperialist control of their finances. Their uprising was crushed, and Egypt was occupied by the British from 1882 to 1922. But their nationalistic rage against British imperialism did not in the least stop Egyptian imperialism in the Sudan. What had been Egyptian venture financed had offered by Europeans now became an Anglo-Egyptian venture to imperialize the Sudan. Against Egyptian and European imperialism alike, the Sudanese rose under Mahdi Muhammad Ahmed in 1881 and 1882. The Mahdist troops crushed Egyptian armies. Then in the 1883 and 1885, they annihilated Anglo-Egyptian armies led by Hicks Pasha and Charles Gordon respectively. The Sudanese nationalists were finally overwhelmed at Omdurman in 1898 by an Anglo-Egyptian expedition led by Lord Kitchener. The ensuing Anglo-Egyptian colonization of the Sudan, with British and Egyptian officials jointly ruling it, would last until 1955. Elsewhere in Africa, starting out from their toeholds of 1885, the industrial powers of Europe had by 1900 invaded, conquered, and divided up the entire continent. And would turn out to be what would turn out to have been their last free-for-all. Britain and France, the leading European powers, obtained the lion's share of Africa. Belgium, Germany, and Italy obtained smaller amounts that roughly corresponded with the levels of maturity of their industrial nationalisms. Having gobbled up Africa, the European powers turned their attentions to East Asia, Southwest Asia, and Eastern Europe. They trained their industrial appetites on feudal China, the feudal Ottoman Empire, and feudal Habsburg Austro-Hungarian Empire. Their designs upon these lands would, however, run into crippling difficulties brought about by fierce native resistance and by a further enlargement of the pack of predatory nations. They would not completely succeed. In the first place, Russia, though not a Western European country, had seen the growing power of Western Europe and become afraid, and had autonomously reformed herself along Western lines. This process had been initiated by Tsar Peter the Great during the period 1700 to 1725. Russia was already a sprawling feudal Euro-Asiatic land empire by 1700. Her reform of all her institutions and her subsequent beginning of industrialization had earned for her a place in the powerful councils of Western Europe. By the time Britain, France, and Germany and Italy were preparing to carve up China's neighbors to the north was powerful enough to want a share of for herself. In the second place, Commodore Perry's mission to force Japan to open herself to Western trade had backfired. It had only served to trigger the systematic and autonomous reformation and industrialization of Japan known as the Meiji Restoration. Japan, thereby was saved from Western European conquest and colonization. She demonstrated her new power by winning the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, and so proved her quality with the West. She then proceeded to join in the Western scramble for China. In the third place, the United States had industrialized after her fledged foray into gunboat diplomacy, had alerted Japan to her dangers, and had provoked the Meiji reforms. The United States, with her post-Civil War industrialization in full drive, had gone on to make her expansionist mark in 1899 by seizing Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines from what was still left of the Spanish Empire. Thus, while the Western European powers were carving up Africa, the industrial revolutions of Japan, the United States, and Imperial Russia moved their various industrial nationalisms to expansionist maturity. Therefore, as the 19th century drew to a close, these nations joined the old pack as it converged upon East Asia, Southwest Asia, and Eastern Europe. The result of all these developments was that whereas the scramble for Africa 1885 to 1900 had been purely a Western European affair, whereas the scramble for the feudal Habsburg and Ottoman empires would, for geographical reasons, be another European affair, the scramble for China would not be. Obviously, the Western European expansionist ambitions had gotten infectious. The Industrial Revolution had spread beyond Western Europe to release a litter of vigorous and fresh contestants for whatever part of the globe was still left to be imperialized. The scramble for China soon ran into quite unexpected resistance from China's anti-foreign social revolutionary movements. Consequently, to Western Europeans of the time, the world was no longer what they expected it to be. The days of easy ascendancy were disappearing right before their eyes. The field of contestants was becoming glutted, and the customary aggression of Western Europeans now upon the rest of the world was running out of easy prey. Western European memoirs of the turn of the century record a sense of transition, especially as World War I approached. They lament an ebbing of the West's sense of confident expansionism. They express a faltering in the West's confidence in scientific progress, and they deplore incursions of nihilist violence and mass hysteria. The world henceforth would never be quite the same, they lamented. To the perceptive, it seemed as if an old familiar world were dying, as if a new and quite unintelligible one were rising. Upon its ashes, the year 1914 would come to be regarded as the year that ended an era, and the shot at Sarajevo, Sarajevo, as the shot that shattered a calm, formidable, and familiar world of easy predatory expansion. This sense of the passing of an era reflected three realities. One was the triumph of industrialism, a triumph whose cultural consequences have been volubly commented upon. The second was the closing, after 5 centuries, 1415 to 1914, of the global frontier of Western European expansion. From then on, any newcomers to the expansionist game would have no virgin lands and no quote-unquote virgin lands, and no unassaulted peoples to assault. For 5 centuries, it had always been possible for newcomers to the game, while also assaulting the possessions of their predecessors. to take over some land and people not yet brought under the heel of other Europeans. From about 1900 on, they would have no choice but to carve their empires, if they desired one, out of places already occupied by or under the fierce claim of some other European imperialists. The third new reality was the ending of the white monopoly over industrialization and its brand of expansionism. The Russians had early enough joined the Western European tradition, but they were, if not Western European, at least white Europeans who had expanded eastwards across Asia to the Pacific. But the Japanese were neither. The confident tones of white superiority that had attended 5 centuries of assaults upon the non-white world would henceforth falter noticeably, while the blunting of the racial arrogance of the West is still in progress today, and while the consequences of the Industrial Revolution for Western society and the whole world have been extensively discussed, the impact of the closing of the global expansionist frontier has not received the attention and it deserves, just as her experience on her domestic frontier shaped America. The closing of that frontier has brought about stresses that have helped reshape America ever since. On the global scale, a similar thing has happened. The experience of expansion into what for her was a global frontier helped to shape Europe as well as the world she overran. After 1900, the rapid closing of that frontier began to remake the contemporary world. The massacre of Amerindians at Wounded Knee in 1890, Teddy Roosevelt's charge up Kettle Hill in the Battle of San Juan in 1898, Kitchener's charge at Omdurman to avenge General Gordon's death in the Sudan in 1898, and the Allied Western Expedition that captured Peking in 1900 would be some of the last frontier-style operations carried out by Western Europeans and their diaspora, and the contest over what remained of the vanishing global frontier. European rivalry over empire became infernally deadly, like the explosion of a sealed, highly pressurized boiler. Hostilities between European expansionist powers soon exploded into World War I as newcomers tried to wrest empires from others who already had a hold on or expressed prior claim to them. It was a struggle made desperate and ferocious by the fact that there were no more unoccupied lands to be had, a struggle made even more deadly by the advances in weaponry resulting from the Industrial Revolution. This was no longer a matter of riding roughshod over weaker natives. It was the grim battle among desperate contenders hungry for the last crumbs. The youth of the European nations would bloodily slug out their imperial rivalries in the trenches of Europe. Let us see what occurred. Soon after 1900, the European latecomers to imperial expansion, Germany and Italy, began a serious search for lands on which to prey. Italy snatched parts of Libya, 1911 to 1912, and intrigued to annex parts of the Balkans. Germany, the strong rising power, arriving at the expansionist game, sought overseas commercial outlets commensurate with her industrial, but found most of the world already preempted. Not satisfied with what territories she had grabbed in Africa and New Guinea, she turned her attention to Eastern Europe and Southwest Asia, and also joined in the starting scramble for China. In Europe, Germany sought an Eastern Empire at the expense of the industrialized Russian Empire, and also through gaining hegemony over the medieval Habsburg and Ottoman empires, which were in danger of breaking up under the pressures of Russian ambitions and the revolt of their captive nationalities. If successful, this eastward thrust of German imperial effort would create an imperial Germany with a sphere of influence that would reach from Berlin to Baghdad. Britain, Russia, and France took alarm at this prospect. Their alarm intensified as Germany forged a mutual assistance alliance with Austria-Hungary and Turkey. Their alarm intensified as Germany forged a mutual assistance alliance with Austria, Hungary, and Turkey, proclaiming themselves the entente powers. Britain, France, and Imperial Russia ganged up against the German, Habsburg, and Turkish imperial allies and sought to prevent their coalescence. When in 1914 Serbia sought to assert her independence from Habsburg Empire, Austria moved to crush her. Russia moved to aid Serbia. Germany and Turkey moved in to protect their ally Austria, and Britain and France went to the aid of Russia. The entente powers were finally pitted against their feared rival Germany, and World War I had begun. Hoping to receive a good share of the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, Italy joined the entente powers. Japan's designs for China made her fight on the entente side, with her allies forced to concentrate on affairs in Europe. Japan seized German concessions in China and then moved to grab as much of China as she could before her competitors in the scramble could return to East Asia in full force. Russia, convulsed in 1917 with an internal revolution, transformed herself into an anti-expansionist Soviet Union and dropped out of the war. The United States of America entered the war to fight in the entente ranks. The war ended with the defeat of Germany, Austria, and Turkey. Germany lost territory and population in Europe and had her colonies in Africa and Guinea taken from her by the victors. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken up out of its territory and out of the eastern parts of the Russian Empire. Such new nations as Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, Hungary, and Yugoslavia were created and made client states of the Entente powers. The Ottoman Empire, too, was carved up into Turkey, Italy and Libya, and the British and French protectorates of Palestine, Transjordan, Iraq, Kuwait, Lebanon, and Syria. Britain and France, the leaders of the imperialist pack, retired to a confident enjoyment of their empires, secured against German, challenged by victory, and enlarged with parts taken from the German overseas empire. America, their ally and rescuer, retired across the Atlantic to concentrate on exploiting the vast resources of the Western Hemisphere she had reserved for herself with her Monroe Doctrine of 1823, as well as to develop her interests in China, while Britain, France, and the United States were content latecomer victors. Japan and Italy and latecomer loser Germany shaft. Japan's gain in China and Korea did not satisfy her ambitions, and Libya only served to whet Italy's dream of an African empire. These dissatisfactions would fester, and by 1939 would produce an alliance of Germany, Italy, and Japan, which would try to force a redivision of imperial spoils among the industrial powers of the world. World War I had neither decisively crippled Germany nor absorbed the last frontier regions into the empires of the victors, and thereby put them beyond the ambitions of the latecomers. China, Ethiopia, and the new client states in Eastern Europe and Southwest Asia were still open to Japanese, Italian, and German ambitions, when and if they felt able to seize them. With her frontier drive trapped and her belief that her industrial prosperity and national pride depended on her ability to expand and exploit other peoples and other lands, Germany raised a loud cry for Lebensraum, a living space. Under Hitler, Germany set out again to colonize Eastern Europe. Italy, dreaming of an African empire, invaded Ethiopia, the only part of Black Africa not already a European colony or a United States client state. Japan set out to create a Japanese empire that she delicately named and advertised as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Zone. She hoped to do this by dispossessing the Western Europeans of their empires in Southeast Asia, by seizing Korea, and by conquering China. These attacks by frustrated imperial latecomers on the presumed but unsecured preserves of Britain and France led to World War II. Germany raised a loud cry for Lebensraum, living space. Under Hitler, Germany set out again to colonize Eastern Europe. Italy, dreaming of an African empire, invaded Ethiopia, the only part of Black Africa not already a European colony or a United States client. Japan set out to create a Japanese empire that she delicately named and advertised as the Greater East Asia co-prosperity zone. She hoped to do this by dispossessing the Western Europeans of their empires in Southeast Asia by seizing Korea and by conquering China. These attacks by frustrated imperial latecomers on the presumed but unsecured preserves of Britain and France led to World War II. America, though chronologically a latecomer, and like Japan, Italy, and Germany, was by no means a power starved of empire. Her domination of the Central and South American republics made her an imperial power, with much to lose in the event of victory by the challengers. Her ties with Britain helped her further commit her to preserving the imperial status quo. Besides, one of the plums she had seized from Spain, the Philippines, was coveted by Japan, and her growing interest in China would be lost if China fell to Japan. Her interest therefore committed her to enter the war once again on the side of the defenders of the existing imperial division of the world. The general war of imperial redivision of the world raged from 1939 to 1945. In it, the victims of imperial rule were marched off to far-flung battlefields to fight and die so their exploiters could retain possession over them. But by the time the war dust cleared, a profound change had come over the world. World War I had opened a confusing phase for Western European expansionism, a phase marked by a closing of the frontier, a proliferating of imperial ambitions among nations, and a bitter struggle between members of the enlarged industrial community over the last frontiers in Eastern Europe. Southern Asia and China, now World War II added to the problems of Western Europe. It weakened the structures of the empires and cracked open the imperial tomb under which Western Europe had contrived to bury most of the world. Out of that tomb, subject peoples began to emerge to demand and claim their national independence. The Vietnamese declared their independence from the French, the Indonesians from the Dutch. Even as the war raged everywhere else, the genie of third world nationalism came rushing out of the cracks, making the world quite unmanageable for Europe. In addition to those troubles, though the Axis challenge had been defeated, it was thanks to the United States and the USSR. While the war raged, world power had fled from Western Europe to the United States and the USSR. These two nations had finally emerged as the foremost powers of the world. Western Europe had slipped down in a few notches on the global power pole. That too made London, Paris, Amsterdam, and Brussels feel uncomfortable with the post-war world. What would the United States and the USSR do with their new eminence? How would the genie of anti-colonialism be contained and the fruits of victory be preserved? These were some of the central questions facing the rulers of Western Europe after World War II. Western European powers had been weakened. Western European hegemony over the world was beginning to wane. From China, where all foreign powers would soon be expelled by a Chinese nationalism led by Mao, to India, where the British would soon be pressured to withdraw, it was clear that Western European expansionism was in retreat. But at what manner of retreat? Were they retreating to retire forever, or were they retreating to regroup for another assault upon the rest of us? In the years since World War II, the widespread emergence of the nationalisms of the Third World, i.e., of those who were victims of the Western European expansion and imperialism, has brought other pressures to bear upon the West. Not only is the frontier closed, not only do they have nowhere else to imperialize, except perhaps the moon and the planets, but what they expected to rule over is slipping from their grasp. These developments have contributed in no mean way to the crisis of the West today. But the crises of the West are not our theme. We are here concerned with the reaction of the rest of us to Western aggression, with the result of our resistance and the consequences of the future of the world of our recapture of partial sovereignty after World War II, our reactions to Western European expansion, to the White Peril, place the rest of us in two groups. One group, made up of Russia and Japan, successfully resisted colonization, even semi-colonization by the West. They did so by autonomously carrying out their own industrial revolutions and by subsequently defeating invading Western armies, thereby asserting their equality with the West. The second group consists of those who suffered total semi-colonization. They constitute what has come to be known as the Third World. Among them must be reckoned Thailand and Ethiopia, which, though not conquered and occupied for long by Western powers, never developed that independent industrial capability which would have enabled them to escape clientage to the West. Also, Liberia, though nominally sovereign from its birth, belongs here because it was planted by Americans, has always been a client state to them, and has no independent industrial capability. While all the peoples in this second group did undergo Western imperialization, they experienced it in varying degrees and varieties, and with different consequences for the populations. China was invaded, partially occupied, and semi-colonized. South Asia and North Africa were conquered and colonized. Black Africa was conquered and colonized, and a good part of its population was scattered and enslaved in the Americas, and the Amerindians were exterminated, either physically or culturally, under the smothering blanket of Western European immigrants. The shared experience of the devastation and humiliation under the boots of the expansionist West is what unites the Third World. The lesson of the success of Russia and Japan in avoiding conquest and colonization and the lesson of China's recent escape from its partial conquest and semi-colonization is that those whose initial resistance had been sufficient to repel Western invasion must carry out an autonomous social and technological revolution. That is the secret of avoiding perpetual subjugation. In order to explore the ramifications of the problem confronting the rest of us, we might do well to examine in some detail the Euro-African connection, from its inception to the present, to see how it visited Africa with the Holocaust of slaving, the trauma of invasion and conquest, the humiliation and complexes of occupation, and with a systematic and continuing impoverishment. For outside of the Amerindians who were exterminated, black Africans and their diaspora have suffered the most from the white peril. Moreover, if black Africa must make a place for itself in the world being fashioned today, it is important for Africans and their diaspora to examine the legacies that their 5 centuries of deleterious contact with the West have bequeathed them. Others might also benefit from such an examination. For the view from down under, the view from the lowest depths may reveal telling details of our common plight, details unobtainable from anywhere but the bottom of the pit.